We are joined by Nicole Marwell and Nick Feamster to talk about their Broadband Equity and Access Initiative. They will introduce themselves, I'm sure, and be able to explain this initiative far better than I, but we have some quick kind of formal introductions of them before we get started. So Nick Feamster is Neubauer Professor of Computer Science and the Director of the Center for Data and Computing. Previously, he was a full professor in the Computer Science Department at Princeton, where he directed the Center for Information Technology Policy. Prior to Princeton, he was a full professor in the School of Computer Science at Georgia Tech. He was also an early stage employee at LookSmart, later acquired by AltaVista, where he wrote the company's first web crawler, and at Damballa, where he helped design the company's first botnet detection algorithm. His research focuses on many aspects of computer networking and network systems, with a focus on network operations, security, and censorship-resistant communication systems. Nick is also an avid distance runner for folks who don't know, and he's completed over 20 marathons across the US, as well as the Comrades Marathon in South Africa, which is an ultra marathon. If you aren't already following Nick on Twitter, it's a very good follow. He details all of his runs across the city, and it's a great way to get to know Chicago as well. All right, so next I will introduce Nicole Marwell, who is Associate Professor in the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. She is also a faculty affiliate in the Department of Sociology, a faculty fellow at the Center for Spatial Data Science, and a member of the Faculty Advisory Council of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. Previously, she was an associate professor of public affairs at Baruch College, the academic director of the Baruch Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management, and a member of the sociology faculty at the CUNY Graduate Center. She also received her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. Dr. Marwell's research examines urban governance and draws on an interdisciplinary set of insights and tools from sociology, organization studies, ethnic studies, political science, and public administration. She understands cities as complex and shifting sets of interorganizational relations and uses qualitative, quantitative, and historical methods to explore how changes in this meso level of social structure affect urban cohesion, inequality, and exclusion. We are joined by Nick and Nicole today to discuss one of the fruits of their really exciting interdisciplinary collaborations, which is the Internet Equity and Access Initiative. So we're very excited to welcome them here today and to hear more about their project. So please all join me in welcoming Nicole and Nick to the virtual Summer Lab stage. All right.
Okay, thank you, Katie. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Oh, let's see if this will work. Yeah, can everybody see that? Yes, all right. So Nick and I are here today to talk about our Internet Equity and Access project. And in addition to Nick and myself, this project has a team behind it of all the folks you see on the bottom of that slide there. Julia Lane, who's the executive director of CDAC, Guilherme Martins, who's the engineer, Kyle, whose last name I'm forgetting, sorry, Kyle, and Tarun and Jamie, who are both postdocs at CDAC. So we want to acknowledge the work that they've been doing with us as well, because it's been really important to moving this project forward. Let's see. Okay, so probably no one is surprised to hear about the importance of affordable, reliable, and high-speed internet access. The pandemic, of course, has made it abundantly clear to everybody, even if we hadn't been previously paying that much attention, made it really clear how important it is to have reliable access to the internet to do all kinds of things related to daily life, particularly access to education, as well as access to healthcare through telehealth, and to all other facets of sort of economic and civic opportunity. We've really been focused quite a lot in the pandemic on the question of access to education through the internet. One in 5 children under the age of 18 in this country lack that access to broadband internet, and those students are primarily Black and Latinx. So there's a real problem with equity in terms of the way that this divide in access to the internet sits. Economic opportunity is also really affected by this. And so, the real motivation here is, how do we figure out how to increase access to internet that is both high speed and reliable, and also affordable? A lot of the discussion about internet access in the past has been about the rural scenario. And it's true, there are a lot of people in rural areas where there is very little internet infrastructure, and so people cannot get internet at all. But that's only about a third of Americans, our best estimates would say. The 2/3 of Americans who are not connected to the internet at present are not connected to it because of affordability problems. They simply cannot afford to pay the very high prices that we charge in this country for high-speed internet. And so figuring out how to increase equity in terms of this access to opportunity is really important, to figure out how to increase that access to internet. So the internet, in one way, has really survived the pandemic. As Nick could tell us in more detail, people were worried at one point that the internet, the actual physical infrastructure of the internet, was not going to be able to handle everybody going home and doing everything online. Turned out that the internet survived quite well. It was quite robust and resilient. But in terms of the way that the internet has exacerbated social inequality, it's been really clear. The ways that internet access affects all of these things that I was talking about previously, just really became highly visible to everybody, even though there have been activists working on this issue of digital equity for at least 20 or 25 years. So in that sense, Nick and I are somewhat late to this issue, but hopefully, the sort of opening that the pandemic provided for more people to become aware of this question, and also for Nick and myself to really start thinking about it and working together on it. Really interesting things are happening in the policy world around internet. Investment has been increasing, here and there over time, but as anyone paying attention to the news really knows, this bipartisan infrastructure proposal that's sitting close to being passed in Congress is allocating a huge chunk of money, about $65 billion for broadband. And so that is a massive investment. And the question that Nick and I are really curious about is, how is that money going to be invested? There are a lot of people talking about the question of speed. There's a lot of people talking about the question of infrastructure, and there are fewer people talking about the sort of human factors and the lived experience of people who actually are using the internet, right? So what is the quality of experience look like when you're on a call like this, or when you're in a classroom like this? Are you, sitting there waiting for your internet to buffer all the time? Are you not hearing what your teachers or your classmates are saying? Are you not hearing what your doctor's telling you, right? These are all issues about quality of experience, that lived experience of the internet. And, knowing how to use the internet is also a really critical issue in terms of knowing how to make sure your Wi-Fi is set up properly, knowing how to get online and search for information. These issues of digital skills and digital use are also something sort of in the human dimension, which is where my work is focused. And then, of course, as I already mentioned, the question of cost is a really critical issue. A really interesting program that happened in Chicago this year. Chicago was really a leader, working together with the city and private donors and some nonprofit organizations in the digital access space. The Chicago Connected program was launched, which provided a free internet connection to upward to 100,000 Chicago Public Schools students. One of the challenges with that was that even though this benefit was offered for free to all of those Chicago Public School students, a surprisingly large number of them didn't take it up, right? You would think you get a free offer of internet, and you don't take it. And so trying to figure out why the take-up has been so low. This piece on the slide says only a quarter of the 100,000 students. I think it's up to about half of the eligible 100,000 students, but still that's a big gap in terms of figuring out why aren't people taking this up. And so while there are a lot of technical issues, and Nick is going to get into a lot of those shortly, you know, we're also really concerned in this project with some of these human issues in terms of lived experience and sort of educating people about how the internet can be of benefit to them beyond what they can do on their smartphone, for example, and also really trying to figure out what it is that is causing, I don't know, maybe we could start calling it internet hesitance. I don't know if that's a good term or not. So these are some of the issues that really fall in that intersection between technology and the social components. And so this is one of the things that we're really looking at in this project. So what's the moonshot here? It's the idea of internet equity, that all communities and all members of all communities have an equal opportunity to be connected to the internet in a way that serves their needs, right? Internet infrastructure, it turns out, is a lot more complicated than some other versions of infrastructure. We've been learning a lot about all the different pieces. And so, you know, we want to be able to be understanding the different needs that communities have, rather than offering simply a one-size-fits-all solution, because a one-size-fits-all solution has not been working up till now. And so figuring how to connect everybody to the internet in a way that's reliable and affordable and meets their needs is really critical. In Chicago, you know, we have very significant digital divide here in the city. And, you know, the Chicago Connected program is one effort to try and address that. It's only focused, though, on Chicago Public Schools students. And of course, there are many people in Chicago neighborhoods, particularly as you look on this map on the south and west sides of Chicago, right? The darker red you get on this map, the larger the fraction of households in each of these neighborhoods is actually connected to the internet with a broadband wired connection. You can see the lighter colors and all the white also in the south side and on the west side of Chicago. And so right here in neighborhoods close to the university, we're seeing these low levels of connectivity. And that's not just school children, which is what Chicago Connected was aiming for, but also plenty of other households that don't have school children in them. And so, you know, figuring out, and this is something that the city of Chicago is working on. It's something that, you know, different nonprofit organizations are thinking about. It's something that Nick and I are really thinking about. How do we improve these connection levels so that we do get this moving closer to the idea of equity in internet connectivity? Okay, oops. Oh, as you can see in this upper right-hand corner of the slide, there was a November ballot item asking voters in the city of Chicago if the city should be doing something to figure out how to connect everybody in the city to broadband. You can see there's very high support, almost 90% support for the city to be doing something. And so the city is taking that to heart and trying to figure out what to do. But it's a little bit of a Wild West scenario, which we'll get into a little bit more soon. Okay, so I want to just take a minute for me and Nick to tell you a little bit about how we found each other and how we came to this work and to forming this interdisciplinary research project. And since I've been talking for a while now, maybe I'll just turn it over to Nick so that he can have first crack at talking about that story for him.
Sure. I think, so Nicole and I have been working together now for just about a little over a year. I should say the area of network measurement, monitoring, et cetera, is not new for me. I've been working in the area for probably almost a decade, and we'll talk about some of the technical aspects of that soon. But as I sort of continue to work on this project and in this area, I should say, and had a desire more to focus on some of the, actually solving the problems of equity. It becomes immediately apparent that the problem is not, it's a technical problem, as we'll talk about. It involves a lot of, the need for good data, but also it cannot solely be solved with technical approaches, methods, answers, if you will. And so I think we got connected through some other offices at the university, in particular the Office of Civic Engagement and the K-12 Outreach Office. Some of the folks who work in those offices made the connection that between the two of us, and I think immediately I sort of saw, that this is going to be a great opportunity to bridge the gap between some of the more technical, data-oriented sides of computer networking and many of the issues that Nicole just talked about, which are really part and parcel and central to this problem, but most computer scientists don't actually know very much about beyond just headlines. And yet the success of efforts like this ultimately rise and fall on people, how people organize, how they govern technical solutions, how they respond to policy initiatives, how they respond to financial incentives, and so forth. And I don't really know much about any of that. And so I think Nicole and I got together and started talking about this problem, and we've been working together for more than a year now. I think we kind of started, our first discussions were probably about just over a year ago. So.
Yeah, and just to add a little from my end, the internet is not something that I had ever done research on. And, as Katie said in my introduction, my work as a sociologist really focuses on understanding, colloquially speaking, how things get done in cities and why. And so, some of the tools of my discipline, the analytical and theoretical tools of my discipline, have allowed me to think about the problem of addressing this internet equity problem in using some of the same approaches that you can think about, many other problems of inequity in urban settings. And so, if there's any social scientists out there, you have to have a kind of a willingness to learn a bunch of new stuff. Like I've learned a lot about the internet and about Wi-Fi and about, a little bit about computer science here and there, but you don't have to be an expert in those fields in order to work on the problem, right? You need partners who are experts. And that's how you build an interdisciplinary approach. And the thing that I really appreciate about Nick in this partnership has been, he's got curiosity about what I'm doing, just like I've got curiosity about what he's doing. And that really, I think, is the fundamental necessity in an interdisciplinary research approach. The partners have to be interested and value the contributions that are coming from very different sides of the analytical spectrum. Okay, so Nick, do you want me to do this last slide, or do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, go for it, and then I can kind of I can jump in after that.
Okay, so as Nick and I have worked on this questions over a year, I think it's been a really big learning experience for both of us, both sort of figuring out how to think about the way that the broadband problem sits for both of us in terms of our own research interests, and then to figure out, what is it that people in the real world care about in terms of this problem, right? So the first step has been to think about data collection and analysis. You know, you can't really move forward with proposing solutions to real world problems unless you understand the extent of the problem. And so the first part of the project, and the one that's really starting to get underway, is to do some really interesting new data collection about the quality and performance of the internet in Chicago neighborhoods. And so there is public data on broadband access out there and about broadband infrastructure. Nick is going to talk to you in a minute about why most of that data is not that great. And so the idea here in this segment of the project is to actually work with people in their homes to measure the performance of the internet that they are experiencing at home, right? What is people's lived experience of our very jerry-rigged internet infrastructure when you get down to it? And so we're collecting this very fine-grained data on a variety of internet performance indicators continuously over time, which is also something unique in the broadband data space. And so Nick is going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. The second piece of the project is to think about, you know, how can we share these data with various stakeholders who might be interested. So that's going to include producing public-facing maps and a portal where people can go and explore the data themselves. It's going to be producing integrated data sets that different stakeholders, from policymakers to community residents and, you know, community-based organizations, local politicians, producing those data sets so that people can really dig in on the places that matter to them the most. Also some open source hardware and software tools, and eventually we hope some policy recommendations on, you know, the internet is a strange entity, right? Unlike a lot of our infrastructure, which is publicly owned and controlled, the internet is a privately owned and controlled infrastructure. And that creates a lot of differences and a lot of questions for how we're going to govern that moving forward. And then finally, the third piece of the project is about solution development. It became very clear to me and Nick that, you know, people think internet data can be interesting, but what people really want to know is, what's it going to do for me? How is it going to help me improve my lived experience of using the internet for the things that I need it for, such as education and telehealth and, you know, even watching Netflix, right? And so we're starting to work on thinking about how we can deploy and test some alternative broadband solutions. So not making the solution that everybody just connects into Comcast or AT&T or the major internet service providers, given their problems with affordability and, you know, also with performance, particularly in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So are there alternatives? Can we think outside the box for how to have new solutions, such as community-based Wi-Fi networks, which, you know, the technology has improved enormously over the last 10 to 15 years, but we haven't really seen significant efforts to try and stand those things up yet in the way that we're thinking about doing it. So this would include figuring out how to build research testbed, and of course, doing all of that in close collaboration and partnership with stakeholders in the communities that are really the ones on the bad side of the equity divide. So Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you here.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Nicole, for a brilliant first half. I'll try to follow up. It's a tough act to follow. But let me talk a little bit more about first how we're thinking about data, and then I'll talk a little bit about where we are in the project. You know, and both in terms of some things we've learned prior to the project, and also some things we're learning already, and I think where we go from here. So I think let's talk a little bit about data, since this is the Center for Data and Computing Summer Lab. So I think one of the things that makes this project interesting is, in order to get a handle on the type of questions that Nicole was talking about, it's important to think about what data is best suited to address or answer those questions. And as we'll see in the coming slides, I think what I put here seems kind of obvious in hindsight, but it's very, very different to to how people are thinking right now. So there are a bunch of different ways that you could think about internet experience. By the way, Nicole, I can share too. I just realized you're perfectly synchronized with me, but
Yeah,
I think I can just
I'll stop.
swap
Yep.
to my thing there.
Go.
So there are different aspects, different aspects of data, different facets when we talk about, as Nicole put it, the lived experience. Most of you are probably familiar with the upper left box. Like if you've ever run a speed test, if we were in the room, I'd say, does anyone ever done this? So maybe just put your Zoom hands up. So if you have, you kind of know what that is. And that's fine. That's like some part of the story, but that doesn't tell the whole story, right? And actually, another detail there is it's telling less and less of the story than it used to. Used to be that your ISP was the, typically what we would call a throughput bottleneck, or a bottleneck on your speed, which historically we've thought of as throughput, just like how many bits per second can you move through through a pipe, if you will, from one part of the internet to another. So that's gotten actually kind of complicated for a couple of reasons. One is that like ISP speeds, if you haven't noticed, like they're marketing faster and faster speeds. Like you can use 10 years ago, you could buy 10 megabits per second, and that was pretty good. Now you can buy a gigabit per second. Faster speeds than that are coming. And so that's all fine. That's probably good. A couple things come up though. One is that when you make that part of the internet, your path from the laptop that you're sitting right in front of to like, the Zoom server or wherever you're browsing the web right now, there's many things on that path. There's your laptop, there is your Wi-Fi connection, there's your home router, there's your ISP, there's whoever your ISP connects to on the other side, right? Whether it's Netflix or Zoom or whoever. That's a lot of parts. Now, it used to be the ISP was the slowest part, and so doing a speed test would kind of tell you everything you needed to know about where the problem was. And that's kind of no longer the case for a number of reasons. One, the most obvious thing I'll just point out, could be your Wi-Fi. I'll tell you right now, I work in this area, and my Wi-Fi is slower than, it's slower than my ISP, the speed that I buy from my ISP. I've got a hard time actually making sure that my home network is not the bottleneck. If I'm having problems, chances are other people are too. So that's one thing that's made things more complicated. Another is that we're using all kinds of different kinds of applications. So, it used to be that the internet meant, browsing some static web pages, like maybe reading the news or something, or sending a few emails. And now it's just not that, right? We do everything over the internet. We like, adjust the temperature in our house over the internet, right? We play games, we watch movies, we have Zoom calls, we have Summer Lab over the internet, and that's a wide range of applications. And the requirements for those applications are different. Whether you're moving a gigantic file from point A to point B, or you're sitting here in Summer Lab, or you're, shopping on your phone, the applications require very different things of the network to give you like a good lived experience. And so there's this whole area of like application quality of experience that, we're still trying to basically figure out how to characterize and measure. Another thing that you'd be surprised to know is that we actually don't even have a very good handle on where physical infrastructure is. So as Nicole was talking about equity early on, do you know, looking outside your front door right now, do you know where, there's fiber in the ground? Or do you know where the nearest, cable node is, right? That could deliver internet service to your house? Which telephone pole is it on? Well, is it on a pole? Maybe it's underground. where's the nearest cell tower, right? Where's the nearest 5G radio access point? I don't know. Anybody know? Right. Well, so exactly. So a lot of people don't know. It turns out actually even even the ISPs don't know some of this information. Nobody has a holistic view of that, and so that's another aspect of the project that we're trying to get a handle on. And then I think, as Nicole pointed out, and as we talked about in our sort of interdisciplinary story, you could actually nail those 3 quadrants, but if you don't get the bottom right figured out, none of this really matters. You could build like the best infrastructure, but then if you can't figure out why, how to make it affordable or how to get people to realize that they need it, then there's not much point. And so there's lots of data to be collected with respect to that as well. Okay, so getting a little bit more into the data science, right, and sort of data. Now I'm in the top left quadrant, speed testing. Okay, so let's just talk about speed testing for a while. I already told you that it's not enough, but one thing you'd be surprised to know maybe is that like people still haven't like broken out of that top left quadrant. They're still basically only really looking at speed. Okay, fine. But even if you take that as, okay, that's a useful quadrant, there's still so many problems with the data that people are using that it's almost not responsive to many of the questions of like, how do we actually solve this problem? So one of the tricky things is that, and you've probably seen these maps, right? How many people seen a map of like, here's what broadband speed looks like across the United States. Look how bad it is, or look how fine it is, right? Well, how is that data collected and sampled, right? So just to give you an example, speed tests, right? Many people have run that. How do you run it? When do you run it? First of all, how do you run it? Maybe you run it from your phone. Well, okay. That assumes, like, if you're going to measure, internet, if you're going to do a speed test from your phone to measure, I don't know, Comcast, well, that assumes you have Comcast, right? It assumes that you're taking the measurement inside your home. It also assumes that the Wi-Fi isn't the bottleneck, among other things. But and when are you going to do it? Well, you're probably going to do it when you have some kind of problem, right? Either you do it when you sign up for the service or there's something's going wrong. And so there's all kinds of sampling issues here that come up from like a so-called client-based speed test. And you can see one of our team members here has looked at like, how does, who's running these tests map against, the medium household income in corresponding tracks. You can see that, richer people run more speed tests. It's basically the conclusion you can quickly draw from the left plot. The right plot's a little better. The Federal Communications Commission actually does what's called a router-based test. They sign up panelists, much like professionals would recruit survey participants, and they have a sample across the United States of, I think, something like 1,500 participants who contribute data. And it kind of measures off your home router every couple hours, and so you get you buy a sample as far as timing is concerned, and they've done a little bit better with demographics, as you can see, but they've got like 2 or 3 of these boxes in all of Chicago, right? So you can see now where there might be other problems there. Here is something, so just to kind of draw a finer point on it, this is shaded according to how many speed tests are run in that geographic tile, Ookla speed test. So you can see, again, lots of people running speed tests on the north side of Chicago. It looks a bit spottier on the south side. So imagine now you're trying to make a case for internet equity, and you want to make cases about like, well, what do speeds look like? And you don't even have the data to do it. So there you have a problem. If you know Philadelphia and Washington, you can see that similar patterns exist there in familiar neighborhoods. Other issues we come into are, this is a project where we have to build the systems to get the data that we want, because as I just mentioned, there are problems with existing data sets. So why don't we just go out and get it? Well, one of the things that we got to do then is we need to deploy equipment to actually get data. Here's something that we'd love to do, but it's very challenging. Okay, in your home, you probably have a cable modem, you probably have a home router. you might have a Wi-Fi access point. Like maybe if you have a larger house, you have a Wi-Fi mesh setup or something like that, or concrete or something. So you might have a separate router or an access point, or you might have one box that does both, like something that you bought and you plug into your modem and it does both of those things. You might, all three of those might be one box if you bought it from or leased it from your ISP. Now, here's the thing. In order to get certain kinds of measurements, for example, let's suppose I'd like to know how your Zoom call's going for SummerLab. Did you experience any glitches? Did you experience, spotty connectivity? Did I freeze? Well, in order to do that, I need to see your traffic, right? In order to see your traffic, there's privacy concerns, of course. If we're talking about this particular project, that brings up not only privacy questions, but questions of trust. But then we've also got to stick a box like in the middle, like in between your router and your access point. And so that's pretty challenging, right? Because anybody who's touched your home network recently, I mean, I'm like scared to touch my own because every time I touch it, something breaks, right? And I like to think I know what I'm doing. So, what are we going to do? Mail something to someone like a Raspberry Pi and a network switch? Looks kind of scary. Hey, would you mind dismantling your whole network and like plugging things in this way? That would be lovely. We would get a lot of nice data. It's just not going to work for deployment. And so what we generally have to do is kind of settle. Okay, we have to sort of give up some data to say, well, maybe we're not going to get every detailed instance of this particular Zoom call. But we can take that Raspberry Pi instead, plug it in behind, into a wired port on the router. So we take this box and just forget this thing, right? And just plug it in over here. And then at least we get some accurate speed measurements, latency, etc. Okay. If you don't do that, right? If you don't do that, you get some pretty crazy data. So let me just talk about that for a second. If you're just operating on speed tests, and Ookla is one of the better ones, speedtest.net, or this is one of the better. There are some bad speed tests out there. Here's one that shows that like none of Pennsylvania has broadband internet connectivity. Okay, okay, fine. If you want to basically beat the drum and shout about how there might be a problem, maybe this map would cause some alarm. The problem is that it's just based on junk data, and so that doesn't help you move the agenda along in any way, shape, or form. One is that people who know what they're talking about, well, this data is garbage. This can be ignored. The second is, supposing you actually want to solve the problem, this doesn't tell you anything about where the problem is. Is it at a street level? Is it the ISP? Is it people's Wi-Fi access points? Is it all the things we talked about? It doesn't really help. Okay. I'm going to skip this a little bit because that just makes the same point. So we are now embarking on basically trying to get better data to answer these types of questions. Okay, so public maps, a data portal, integrated data sets for policymakers and communities, and importantly, and I think this is sort of the thing that we're working on right now a lot, is open source hardware and software tools to allow people to easily get good data. Right. Actually, I was going to let me share. I don't have this on a slide just yet, but brand new stuff. Let me just show you my home, since this is recorded and this is an audience and we have other participants. So I'll just show you my home since I don't mind sharing my own data. But here's sort of the back end. This is probably not what we would show, you on the first cut, but let me give you an idea. So basically, this is something that you can get that's essentially as simple as like plugging a little box into your power outlet and into your cable modem. It takes about 30 seconds. We've got a video showing it. And then you get a bunch of data, and you probably don't know, unless you're, a super expert, you probably can't make sense of all these graphs right away. But let me just show you the top two to give you a sense of what's going on. The first is speed test. Okay, so that's our top left quadrant. It's like, how's internet speed doing? A couple of things I think are important here. One is that we're running multiple tests. Okay, so there's different ways to run a speed test. So we're doing this in different ways. And the second is that we're running it all the time, every couple of hours. So we can see, you know, is it consistent? Are there outages? Are there reliability problems? Are there drops and so forth? Okay. Another thing now coming to basically, you know, moving out of that top left quadrant a little bit is something called latency, right? And latency under load. And this is like, imagine I'm speaking and it would take like half a second for what I'm saying to get to you. We would have a really hard time like having a conversation actually. And we've all experienced this, I'm sure, like over the past year in the pandemic, like there's a Zoom call, I say something and then like someone doesn't hear it and then it like becomes obvious they're not hearing it right away. It's really annoying, right? And then you can't have a conversation. That's latency. Okay, so this is becoming more and more of an issue as we do more interactive things over the internet. And so we're measuring things of that nature as well. More on that maybe on a different day. So here's the thing. I'm not going to show this to you in this live recorded talk, but if you want to, you know, drop by my office in Karrar, I'd be happy to show you more. We've been basically showing this type of plot to some of our early participants and allowing for comparison, right? So it's like, oh, I've signed up in this case for the Comcast gigabit service plan. There's someone else in our, you know, in one of our community-based organizations in one of the communities that we're working with, who's also signed up for the exact same plan. Now we can sit down and compare notes. Hey, what are you getting? You know, oh gosh, actually your latency is 3 times higher than mine. True story. Okay, same service plan, right? Speed test is a little bit lower for this other person, maybe like 10% lower. You know, significant, but maybe not enough to cause super outrage. But latency is like on another level. It's just sitting down comparing these notes can allow, it brings more data to this conversation, right? And this is sort of like, I think right now we're getting hopeful. We're starting to see glimmers of hope because people in, you know, the communities, as we've observed, you know, and policymakers, researchers like us, we all know there's a problem, right? But bringing meaningful data to that problem to allow people to figure out where it is, but also to tell stories like that. It's like, hey, wait a sec, I've got the same service plan as somebody else in a different neighborhood. I'm getting totally different service. What's up with that? So that's a story one can tell. It's also something that allows people to figure out like what's actually going on. I showed that to an ISP recently, and their thought was, that's actually kind of interesting. We don't really know why that's the case. Maybe you know, maybe here are 5 more things that you could look into next, right? To figure out like exactly what's going on, right? So this goes way beyond the like Pennsylvania is orange, right? Now we're talking about telling better stories, bringing data to those stories, and also solving the problems. So these are the kinds of use cases that we're talking about: increasing awareness, figuring out where the problems are so that we could target investment, and ultimately expanding coverage. Okay. This is brand new. Okay, I'll just sort of, and by brand new, we haven't built this yet, but this is sort of, you know, part 3 of the project. It's something that we're really thinking about, is a test bed, right? So it's one thing to point out the problems as we've been talking about. The next thing is basically how do you solve the problems? And some of those problems, as we've talked about, are technical, but some of them are related to the structure of the community, governance, if you will. And this is why this is an interdisciplinary project, right? So in this part of the project, what we're thinking about are doing everything from testing, you know, how suitable are these new radio technologies in the last mile, as well as how do you actually set up, sustain, and manage that kind of infrastructure? Everything from like, you know, how do you deal with security incidents to how do you get people to pay for it and sustain it, to how do you get people to realize that, you know, they might actually be able to make use of it? And so early days on that, but we were working with our partners here at the university to explore ways to build out such a test bed that would allow us to do that. I can skip over that. Just some lessons, I think, you know, that I think we've taken away so far. This list of questions came from the city, okay? And that's actually not, you know, I'm not saying you should always get your questions from the city, But the point here is that the questions came from somebody who wasn't us, right? So what does data science mean to you? Okay, data science, I think Chicago, everybody's still trying to figure out what that phrase means. Here's what it means to me. Data science means taking questions that somebody really wants to know the answer to, figuring out what data you need to gather to answer those questions, building the systems and the infrastructure, and doing the participant engagement and community engagement, recruitment, deployment to get the data, getting the data, and then figuring out, maybe making trade-offs. As I mentioned, there was a trade-off I mentioned between the data we'd love to have versus the data we can get, making the trade-offs, and then taking the data that you have and then figuring out, well, what can I conclude from this? Which of these questions can I reasonably answer? Where is there uncertainty based on my inability to gather some data? And then, of course, there's statistics in there, but there's also computer systems, right? We talked about something like, hey, I can't see the Zoom call, right? So I can't necessarily tell you what's up there. But the point is that we didn't just sit in a room and just dream about like what things we'd like to measure and like, hey, let's make a map. Like that would be cool. Like then you end up with Orange, Pennsylvania, right? We started in talking with our stakeholders, right? And this includes the city. It also includes our community-based organizations and so forth. Quick few final comments. Like here are some of the questions that were posed to us. And I think this is really interesting, right? Because in speaking to students who've been working on the project, some of the PhD students, I think a little bit of apprehension at first, like, hey, how are we going to get computer science research out of this? Like, this seems like a very, complicated social problem, which it is. But, you start with a question like this top one. What's the baseline level of connectivity and speed needed to support remote learning, telehealth, et cetera? Well, we took that and kind of went off and said, like, well, what about video conferencing applications? How would that apply to our situation right here? What speed do you need at home to go to school or run summer lab, right? And so one of the things that we did in that study was look at like how are video conferencing applications like Meet, Teams, and Zoom, how are they using the network? Okay, so these plots show some of that. What we did, these are controlled laboratory studies where we restricted capacity on the network. And basically looked at how these applications responded. So you can think of the x-axis as like your speed in a traditional sense, and the y-axis as like the quality of the video stream measured in bit rate. So you can see that things are like mostly okay for these apps, and then uplink and downlink, of course. Things are mostly okay until you get down below 2. Okay, and I think that's 2 sounds like not very much. Okay, let me sort of throw a few other things out there. Are you doing other things on the network at the same time? You're probably not only listening to me. You're probably like playing like Among Us and browsing Facebook and uploading some videos and 10 other things at the same time, and probably your other people in your house are doing the same thing. So that's one aspect. There's another, as I can tell you that like some of our community stakeholders that we've been working with do have lower speeds. And you can see from these apps as well that things like Microsoft Teams, thank heavens we're not using that for this call, because it uses more bandwidth and it actually responds worse when capacity gets constrained. And so closing the loop, actually just last week we had a meeting with some of our community members, and it's, we can see through the other dashboard I showed you that speeds that person's getting are not as high, right? Sort of in the tens of megabits per second, shall we say. And I said, well, how's your video conferencing? How's Teams? And he was like, actually Teams isn't so great. Hey, I can tell you why. Let me show you some more things. So those are the types of things that we're looking at. So, this comes back, it can tie back to policy, right? The FCC, has like this 25 megabit per second down, 3 up, minimum connection, speed requirement to call yourself broadband connectivity. And we can speak directly to the suitability of, those kinds of baselines with data. We can say, well, if you had 25.3, how are these applications going to respond? I'll skip over that. Another part of the project, and Nicole and I are working with a postdoc in CDAC on this part of the project, Tarun Mangla, is trying to basically map out the physical infrastructure. So there's a couple different parts to this project, but so this slide's actually a little misleading because it's, one aspect is crowdsourcing photos and images. The part that he's working on a lot right now is looking to see what can we learn from city permit data. Anytime basically someone opens the street, there's a dig permit, right? That data is all public, thank heavens to the open data portal that City of Chicago has. And so we can learn a lot about where fiber is in the city based on those dig permits. But this is an interesting problem because the data is dirty, it's not standardized, so there's natural language processing in there. There's also when you get a permit, you have 2 points, right? Here's the start point and here's the end point. It's not always a straight line along a street. It's 2 points are always a straight line, but it doesn't always follow a street. So what do you do? How do you? But we know that trenches get dug in streets. They don't get dug under skyscrapers or rivers or things like that. So how do you map the data and the permit data to give us a map of what fiber might look like? And so that's another part of the project. We talked a little bit about this already, so I'll skip that. And then I think Nicole, maybe I'll leave it to you to wrap up, because I think the other question that I think our stakeholders have asked us, and I think one of the reasons we ultimately got together to work on this is it's not just about hey, we gave everybody internet access, isn't that awesome? First of all, we got them to sign up for it, which they might not even do. But even if they sign up, we still ultimately, I think, only succeed if people have better lives as a result of that. And so that's certainly another aspect of the project. I mean, Nicole, I don't know what we can say about the part of the project with the schools right now, but that's certainly one thing that comes.
Yeah, we can't say anything about it yet, but the good news is that we are going to be able to do an analysis of, what was the actual causal impact of taking up this free Chicago Connected offer on student engagement and student performance in public schools in Chicago over the last year. So that's coming, but it's going to take a little while. A lot of complexities there. And of course, there's a lot of other potential downstream impacts of better connectivity that we could look at, but they're complicated to figure out. But it's definitely something, as Nick says, that's really critical to why stakeholders in the communities we're trying to work with would actually care about this research. So I know we have 1 minute. Sorry, Katie.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Questions.
Yeah, we're done. So we used all of our allotted time. 30 seconds for questions.
No worries at all. Thanks.
Almost asking one here. How transferable are these solution approaches to other countries with a bigger digital divide and less open data? Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I think that, as much as science always wants to develop generalizable solutions that will fix the problem everywhere, something like internet connectivity is really different in different countries, the way that different countries have structured it, funded it, controlled it, et cetera. So you have to start there and understand those distinctions. The idea of alternative solutions, we actually see a lot more on this happening in nations in the global South, as opposed to in the global North. So there's actually a lot of things we can learn from the experience of those countries. I think this is, as the technology evolves and as approaches to governing these questions evolve, there's going to be a lot to learn around the world about these issues. Nick and I are starting here in Chicago. We're hoping it's going to have some generalizability to other urban areas in this country. Not sure how much farther it goes from there, but of course we'll be thinking about it.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll say from a technical side too is that one of the things that that I think internet researchers can sometimes make a mistake on is overgeneralizing when things don't generalize. And so, to give you an example, there are lots of studies of web performance or how fast DNS responds or whatever. But then those studies also need to be done in the global South for example, performance characteristics, the network topology, the technology, et cetera, it can be very different. And so I think there's, as Nicole said, there's sometimes a temptation to generalize results or overstate. But I think coming back to the point, I think different places are different. We've done actually some work of some performance measurements in the Global South, in particular in South Africa and Kenya and a few other places. Just to give you one example of where things don't generalize. We were initially planning, among other countries, to study speeds in Nigeria. This was probably 7 or 8 years ago. And we were like, remember the box thing I told you about? Well, that was all going to work out until we learned out that there was like basically no wired DSL connectivity in Nigeria. Like everybody just used cellular, like basically phones or cellular hotspots. And so it's like, okay, well, I guess we're not doing that study, right? So you design a technology, and then, you know, that's a drastic example, but I think everything is, you know, things can be very, very different in different realms, and I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Fantastic. Do we have time maybe for one more question? I don't want to presume on your guys' time.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, we stampeded the Q&A, so.
No, there's so much interesting things to cover. If we have one more quick question, feel free to raise your hand on Zoom, and we'll address it right now. We may also have addressed all of it in the presentation, which is the sign of a really good one.
Okay.
Well, let's all turn on videos to send a virtual round of applause and thank you. A hefty thank you to Nicole and Nick for joining us. This is an incredibly exciting project, and I'm personally so excited to see the Summer Lab students working on it and to see it continue to grow. So thank you so much for joining us. There are lots of resources on the CDAC website, including some cool visualizations you can play around with, and blog posts kind of busting a lot of myths. So if this is of interest to you, there are lots of online resources. And as Nick mentioned, we have an Internet of Things lab in Currar, and lots of friendly faces who are always happy and willing and eager to talk about broadband internet. So definitely come say hi. And yeah, thank you, Nick and Nicole, so much for joining us. This was fantastic.
Thanks a lot.